Hello, my name is Khalil Corazo. This is my dry run for my October 18th talk at the Frankfurt Book Fair. The title of the talk is Things Hidden Since 1521, wherein I will share my experience of writing my first novel, Raha versus Conquistador, from the perspective of someone who has a background in anthropology. So, looking at that experience, it seemed like very ethnographic. So, I'll talk about how novel writing could be ethnography and the novel as thick description of a culture. So, to start here, well, as a novelist, you will have to choose you have to make choices which historians don't have to. For instance, historians don't really make what you call this like uh, definite choices when it comes to these questions. Now, so I'd like to invite you to speculate what could be the answers to these three questions. Why did Magellan fight a suicidal battle? Second, why did Humabon massacre his allies? And third, what was the role of women in the events of 1521? So at the end of this talk, I'll be sharing some answers from some historians or even like from the primary sources, and I will share my answers as someone who wrote this novel. And the question is like, are those answers did I create like actual knowledge through the process of writing this novel? Okay, uh, So I'd like to compare what I did with what has been done. So this is one of my main sources for this novel, for Raha versus Conquistador. So which is Over the Edge of the World by Lawrence Burr Green. So if we look at the bibliography of Burr Green, there are like around 260 sources there. We could see that what he wanted to create was like how to transform what we know about Magellan in his world into an exciting historical narrative. So this is a history. This is not a work of fiction. This is a work of nonfiction wherein he gathered all those sources from primary accounts, mainly from Picavetta and from other, what you call this, eyewitness accounts and legal documents during the time. Also, if you look at the bibliography, we could see that he used supporting historical contexts, like the technology back in the time, the politics of empire, the economy of like the spice trade, and then the 16th century society and culture of Europe. And then also, of course, he made use of the previous scholarship of Magellan. So this is the best what you call this narrative of Magellan I've read, and just in terms of the execution, like it was an interesting, very interesting read. It's as if you're watching an action adventure film, but it's nonfiction. So what I try to do, in contrast, was that okay? So you have all this like historical knowledge, what we know about history, but what I wanted to experience was like, the inner lives of the people in the 16th century, particularly Magellan, and also from the side of the world back then, the Cebu back then, particularly Humabon. So what I used was some, like books on, our knowledge about the society back then, and what really made this thing, the insight that made me want to write this is that when I read Pigafetta, his depiction of Humabon or his interpretation of Humabon seemed incomplete. But when I connected that figure of Humabon to the figure of the Southeast Asian Orang Besar or the big man, particularly in this book, An Anarchy of Families, which is an ethnography or a collection of ethnographies of Filipino political families, and in particular the figure of like the big man in the family. So his move suddenly made sense. So it's like, okay, I want to see the rest of the story. Of course, I also use like this the anthropology of pre-modern kingship, ritual sacrifice, and all that. Now the and a big this book called Grading, Trading, and Feasting by Laura Yunker was a huge source for recreating that world of 16th century Cebu. So that is my attempt. How do you turn this knowledge into an exciting anthropological novel? For the Magellan side, so I made use of the culture. I tried to recreate the culture of the 16th century conquistadors, no? And mainly I focus actually on the phenomenon or the limpieza de sangre, which is and also Christianity. Anyhow, that was my attempt. But there's more, no? So Pigafetta wrote 161 words in 1521, and I could understand most of them. So if the Sapir-Whorf hypothesis is true, meaning that this hypothesis says that the culture, our culture is, or the way we view the world is framed by the language we use. So the language like influences or is the lens wherein we see the world. So if that's true, and I understand the language of my ancestors back in 1521, then if I travel back in time, so we could sort of like understand each other, not only in terms of language, but in terms of worldviews. So meaning I could use my experience of Cebuano culture in this in recreating that world. So not only the Magellan's, the scholarship of Magellan and the culture of 16th century Europe, particularly the culture of the conquistadors, but also and not only like the culture of the Datus, the psychology of the Datus of 16th century Southeast Asia, but also, my experience of that culture. So that is what I attempted to do. Um, And then after looking back, looking back at that experience, since my background is in anthropology, and in anthropology, the main way you create knowledge is through the process of ethnography, which is capturing the culture through direct experience of that culture. So then I asked myself, it's like that experience, it felt very ethnographic, So, but my main background really, my main focus in the past years has been this intersection of the Austronesian big man or Southeast Asian big man, the Orang Besar, and Rene Girard's scapegoat mechanism. So, because of that, it's like I sort of like for instance, like the main theory that I use for that this recently published paper in the Michigan State University's Contagion Journal. So the main theoretical framework I used was the scapegoat mechanism. Girard talks about it in his book Violence and the Sacred. So the way he formulated that this theory of the scapegoat mechanism, this explanation of why is ritual sacrifice ubiquitous prior to the actual age. So Girard used the ethnographies of 20th century British ethnographers. No? So like Malinowski, like Radcliffe Brown, like Victor Turner, like and Evans Pritchett. No? So these guys were like some pioneers of anthropology, and Girard using those their ethnographies plus some analysis of myths formulated the scapegoat mechanism, meaning, this ethnographies could be sources of cultural theory, or at least that's how Girard used that. So, and then, but also, like to connect it to my experience of the novel as a source of cultural theory, my own experience of creating a kind of ethnography. Girard also, says in his earlier book, was Desire, Deceit, and Novel. And in this book, so Girard did not use ethnographies, but he used novels as a source of his cultural theory. In this book, he formulated his theory of mimetic desire, which is an explanation of like, the nature of human desire, which is in his view is mimetic, and he based that on analysis of novels. So another example is Carolyn Howe's Elites and Ilustrados in Philippine Culture. So in this book, how looks at the what you call this the role. What's the role of elites in Philippine society? And he makes use of um, many novels na, like No Limit to Hungry, El Filibusterismo, Nick Joaquin's The Woman of Two Navels, and Miguel Sijuco's Ilustrado, among others, to answer those questions related to elites and illustrators in Philippine society. And then also Benedict Anderson, used in two chapters here. Um, so he uses El Fili and the Noli as like, his sources for answering some questions about the relationship of or the creation of a nation. So I won't go into detail about I won't go into detail about the, the what you call this the theories or the explanations there. But among I was looking at my library, and these are like the three which immediately came to mind when the theories or explanations based on analysis of novels. Meaning novels could be similar to ethnographies that they capture culture. No? So if we make use of Geertz's what you call this concept of thick descriptions, and so novels could also be thick descriptions of cultures. So, so what did I? So now, like, so if that is true, if novels could be thick descriptions, and so maybe the act of novel writing is similar to ethnography. That me, um, as I what you call this, try to recreate that world, and to live in the minds of Humabon and Magellan in the 16th century, being what you call this, constrained by their cultures, and knowing that through anthropology, and also giving them a kind of specific kind of psychology, then perhaps there is knowledge that was made there, like intuitive knowledge of that culture. And that intuitive knowledge perhaps would give new answers to questions about like what happened in 1521. So the three questions I posed earlier: why did Magellan fight suicide the battle? Why did Humabon massacre his allies? And what was the role of women in the events of 1521? So the first one, so Bergreen has an answer there. So possibly, he says it's possibly a mutiny. I think this is like the third. There were two mutinies recorded during the journey, and this could be the third one. Also, uh, Bergreen thinks that it's like some bravado from previous success, no? Because like Magellan, it was very improbable. The success was very improbable to get to what is now the Philippines. It's like they almost died, and then there was also a miracle that happened that was recorded in with the brother of Humabon, or the brother of Tupas. So it was, Magellan, in the eyes of Bergreen, perhaps felt invincible. But through, it's like now that living, but as a novelist, I had to choose a certainty. It couldn't be a probability. So if you are there in that story, it seems very clear that it was a mutiny, because you have three ships, and then the ones who fought, in the battle were only 60. The biggest ship was the Trinidad. That was the ship of Magellan. So meaning, it's like it seems like the two other ships did not fight in the Battle of Mactan. So Magellan probably, or in the book, certainly didn't have what you call this control over the two other ships, only the Trinidad, which means there was a mutiny. So also now that if you live within the mind of a 16th century conquistador who grew up with stories of El Cid and San Fernando, of the Song of Roland, of the Crusaders. So, it's like how does that guy think? No? So, death is not the worst thing, you know. So these guys, like they are what you call this, they are they bet uh, their bets are huge. Their bets are huge. High risk, high reward. And in the case of Magellan, so if that mutiny is true, so Magellan had very few choices. No? It's either he would become a viceroy of what is now the islands, with the Cebu and the surrounding islands. He could be the viceroy of what is now the Philippines, or part of what is now the Philippines, or he could die a heroic death. So the choice of fighting in Mactan is like win big or lose, gloriously, die gloriously. So that is what a knight would choose. And I think it's quite clear that that is how Magellan thought. No? So, and then why did Humabon? So this happened, like the death of Magellan happened in April 27, 1521. On May 1, 1521, so Humabon invited his allies for a final dinner. No? And then wherein he would give, like, a casket of jewelry for the king of Spain. No? So, but then so Humabon massacred them. So during that dinner. So why did Humabon massacre his erstwhile allies? So um, Pigafetta's interpretation is that it was Enrique's ideas. So you could see it in his, like, in his chronicle. There was also another, what you call this, interpretation from a survivor, and one of these, like, legal documents, I think. They interviewed them after this thing, when they got back to Spain, and he said, like, they killed us, or they killed his companions because they were because of the women, because how they seduced the women of Cebu. And then Bergreen mentions that perhaps Sumabo needed to repair his political relationships after his like he sort of orchestrated this battle. So, and then his side lost, so he needed to repair his relationship with the Datus, particularly with Lapu-Lapu, and then the massacre is, like, a way of doing that. So, but if you're familiar with 16th century culture, especially Datu culture, so important thing is really vengeance. So if you're the Datu, you have the responsibility of avenging the deaths of your men. So that's why they follow you. If you have the reputation of avenging deaths, you are a trustworthy Datu. No? So it's like so that is part of just your role. So you want part of your power, that you have the reputation of exacting vengeance if one of your men dies. So the way that this is done is very ceremonial. They wear a rattan necklace, or rattan, what you call this, bracelet. So which is it's like it stays there until you exact vengeance. So it's called a picket, you know. So since Humabon was now um, a brother of Magellan after they did the blood compact, so he had the duty to avenge Magellan. So avenging, so that vengeance, it was politically um, incorrect, or it was not a good political action to avenge, for that vengeance to be directed towards like Lapu-Lapu, because like it was mess up his political situation even more. But in the story, and I think this makes sense, that vengeance was exacted on the the other Spaniards, because this could be interpreted as they betraying their datu. The Timawa betraying their datu is one of the worst things you could do. So that was that was what you call this, like, that was the duty of Umabon, to exact vengeance, and that vengeance was directed towards the companions of Magellan. Also, there's also an economic what you call this calculation here, because April 7 to May 1, so, or April 27, if I don't count the days after Magellan's death. So that's like 20 days. And the 20 days, so Humabon was their host, and Humabon and the port of Cebu fed them, no? So Magellan refused to pay the tribute, no, that the visitors usually pay the Raja of Cebu when they trade there. Instead, he was like, he said, okay, my king is the greatest king in the world, no? So he was promising a sort of a political advantage, once the king, conquers this entire place for the Raha of Cebu, Humabon. But then, the those promises no longer made sense after his death. So to pay for that, what you call this, expense, yeah, food, drinks, and women. So uh, they had to pay with the only currency they had left, which is in that world. So the port of Cebu and most the that world, the economy of that world was the currency was really slave raiding. So bodies of men were the currency. So the Spaniards essentially paid with their bodies. Their there were four expeditions before Lopez de Legazpi's 1565 um, success of like initiating the colonization of the Philippines. So in one of those expeditions, they found out what happened to the Spaniards who were massacred. Actually, not all of them were massacred, and many of them were sold to slavery. So this is how they paid for the 20 days of feasting in Cebu. And finally, what was the role of the women in the events of 1521? So there's really no, I mean, there's no, what you call this, uh, like analysis of that. So they appear there. The women appear. The wife of Humabon, for instance, there was a bailan performing a slaughter of a pig. There were some attempted sacrifices for the curing of Humabon's brother, or Tupas's brother. So, but it's no, I don't think anyone has really delved into the world of like the women's role there. But then if you write a novel, I mean, it's like it's unavoidable. You have to create the you have to tell the story as well. And this one is really this is based on my experience as a Cebuano. As someone who grew up in a Cebuano family, you know that the women there play a huge role in this. And then when I told, so in the novel, the the this woman, uh, the wife of Humabon, who appears there in the Chronicle of Pigafetta, this one. So she is like a dominatrix of Humabon in this story. And when I told this to my writing coach, he said like, he was a journalist in the past. He said like, the 90% of the politicians he interviewed in Cavite, that was their relationship with their wives. So this is not yet captured in scholarship, no? Also, if you look at the history after the colonization, so there were certainly women who were like for instance, the Bailan were suppressed, but also you had a lot of like what you call this involvement in the new religion. Uh, so Nico Kid talks about this in his chapter in Beatas in History and Culture. So they were very active in promoting this new religion. And also, um, yeah, they were guest relation officers. That also plays a huge. I think they play that part as well. Based on the recollections uh, of Pigafetta, I mean, they were also entertained by the women of Cebu. So the question now is like, did I gain ethnographic knowledge by living inside the minds of Umabon and Magellan and within their cultural constraints? So classic ethnography, you live within the culture. I sort of lived that culture, because I sort of like method acting, and and also I grew up in a variation of a culture. Like it's a similar culture. Yeah, if the Sapir-Whorf hypothesis is true, and like that is still a culture I would understand. Yeah, and then a ethnographer translate the world of the culture into another language, an academic Western language. It is the constraints of that method is that it is, you have to capture it with words, and it is constrained by the form of the ethnography. I mean, so throughout the 20th century and then in the past few decades, there's been a lot of debate on what this should be and what the constraints are in the world of anthropology. But still, whatever you do, you will be constrained by the form and by the words. It's the same thing with the novel. I'm trying to create a world, or like through what we know in the anthropological record and historical record, and it is constrained by the structure of a story. I wanted to make it an exciting story. It's most in English, and it's also constrained by the form of the novel. So the novel has to sound like a novel. So, and lastly, the classic photographer writes thick descriptions, while, and then in this one, I think, it's like based on what the readers have been telling me, it seems like it was also a thick description of that world of Humabon. Because one reviewer said that, she now sees the why of those actions and not only the what of history. Anyhow, that is my experience. I'm still exploring this. Perhaps I'll be writing a paper about this just to, see whether this is something real. But anyhow, I'll stop now, and we could do a Q&A about this. Thank you so much.